I think it was true in the sense. So let me tell you a little bit. He came into my life when I was 18, and I was on my way to college in America, and he told me not to go. He said, Indians, they go to these places, and they come away having learned nothing but the babble. And so my mother said, well, what should he do instead? And he said he should go boldly into the world, which meant nothing when you're 18, because it was, what are you going to do? Just try to get a job and without an education, whatever. But it was a perfect, like, Napoleon provocation. Then he would come in and out of my life in key moments, the publication of a first book.
Was it just provocation, or did it actually mean that, like Indians go in there and come out with nothing but the babble?
Well, that's the classic Napoleon joke, is that there's always a grain of like devastating truth, but there's also humor. So he was trying to get at this idea, firstly, to call my attention to the strangeness of droves of Indians of privilege and going halfway across the world. Did they know what they were going for? Did they know what they wanted from their education? And so he kind of would, I remember him saying at one point, he said, are you going to study the exact sciences? Because in that case it was fine. But if I was going to go and have this humanities education, and I was going to come back full of Foucault and talking about structuralism, what like he was worried that I would have come away with certain attitudes and a lingo that would have got in the way of clearer ways of looking. That before I left, I could see my place very well and describe it, and then I would come back and I would have I would be full of theory.
Okay,
and so he was afraid of that.
Was it intimidating, that what he said? Was it
everything he ever did was intimidating? To be in his presence, the energy crackled. I mean, since then, I think I must have met every Indian writer of note, from Salman Rushdie to Vikram Seth to the whole gamut, Amitav Ghosh. Nobody commanded that kind of presence. When he was around, the air grew still, and it was the force of his concentration, because nobody had listened to you the way Naipaul listened. It was a very simple line of questioning, like the writing itself, where I was such and such years old when I wrote my first clear sentence, and it would build, and by the end you could be completely unraveled by his line of questioning if you
and that's
if you were not a strong person.
That's what kind of happened with your first book, that was as you wrote in that piece also, that his response to your first book wasn't.
It was devastating. I mean, it was my first novel.
Yeah.
And it was this moment where so he'd been in and out of my life, and then suddenly I was on the verge of publishing Stranger to History. He was in India in 2006-07 recording this BBC series on his life. And then suddenly, from being kind of like a friend of the family, he became really my friend. I remember him coming like to my apartment in Delhi, not my mother's, to have like yellow dal. Like he really wanted the yellow dal. That was very important. And suddenly it was another part of his, like, how unusual he was. In India, your parents' friends don't necessarily become your friends,
Absolutely.
But for Naipaul, that didn't exist. So immediately he was interested in me, and he wanted to extend the hand of friendship, and that led to him reading the novel. And it was really horrifying, because I think I was staying with him in Wiltshire as he was reading it, and he got graver and graver. And at one point he wanted me to come and learn in some ways, and I was afraid to, because his influence was so great that I didn't want to be completely drowned out by him. But when he'd finished, he called me up.
Yeah, and you say I could tell from the thickness of his voice that he was in a brutal mood.
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, he was ready to rip me to shreds, and he's like, you don't know what you're doing, you have no talent, you're burdening this novel with your experiences. It was relentless, and it was weird, because I felt, even as I was listening to it, that it was a kind of nervous tension that had taken over him. I thought, and Nadra said this later, she said he was reminded of his own uncertainty as a young man, and he was reminded especially of his relationship with Shiva Naipaul, who again, he was like an 800-pound gorilla. He could just burden you with that, with the power of his personality. And at one point, I remember saying to him, I said, you know, like, well, I should just completely pack it in then. I said, well, do you think I have any possibility to write fiction at all? And he said, yes, of course I do. We wouldn't be having this conversation if I didn't think that. And it was just one moment of, you know, of like, of a sort of respite in what was really shattering. And one shouldn't totally, I mean, I don't want you to go away with the impression that this was always in a good spirit, because this person who was capable of always saying, oh, you know, Nadra, I must think of higher things, he was also capable of being spectacularly petty. And he would not be beyond him to attack a younger writer in a you know, he could
to sort of crush the
many smaller instincts lived alongside very, very grand ones. And the challenge with being with him was always this sense of balancing. When he was a writer, he was unassailable. He was like almost like a priest.
Yeah.
But when he was a human being, you felt a kind of smallness could kick in contrast to this towering talent and commitment to the work as well.
Yeah. You know, taking off from there, you know, Derek Walcott, which again you quote, who believed his concern was a form of contempt, and Edward Said described him as an intellectual catastrophe.
Yeah.
So, like, you know, like, what were your sort of?
No, I don't agree with any of that. I have to say, like, the climate in these universities, there was this post-colonial, and people don't understand, when the British are the cause for all your faults, you've lost agency of your history. You know, everything then has become this act of what was done to you. And Naipaul's line of provocation was to make...
Since he remained a much misunderstood, the politics of his writing remained misunderstood in this country, and even in the West, I guess.
I think he was vilified by the left and wrongly co-opted by the left, by the right.
By the right.
And so he always found himself in these strange positions where he was among people that really didn't, and the right didn't really read him. So, you know, the left read him and hated him, and the right didn't read him and loved him. And so it was a very unfortunate position. And that's what makes the work so interesting to go back to now, because it's finally you have the work that's free of the provocative personality. You know, man and writer have been cleaved apart by death. And so then the work still glitters. You know, I've been rereading even some of the fiction of, like, Bend in the River, for instance, and it's incredible how fresh and strong and interesting it still is.
Yeah, and a lot of the writing that has come up about him post his passing away has mentioned that, you know, you might not have agreed with what he actually said in conversations, but you could not deny what he was writing. You could not deny the greatness of that, the lyricism of that.
Well, it was not the kind of work that, I mean, anyone who's read a book of Naipauls knows that you don't leave with something as simple as a political slogan.
Yeah.
You know, it's a provocation to thought, and actually to read him is to balance many difficult notions in your head at the same time, and that, I mean, that for me is this kind of enduring richness of Naipauls' legacy. And you know, you have to, I mean, nobody staked out that ground. At that point, everyone was caught in a certain historical trap, and he was a free agent in a way, and was able to sort of do this work on the margins of history.
Yeah, I get what you're trying to say. You know, like it's a very complex thing. It's pretty, and you know, you mentioned in the conversations we were having prior to this that he would probably have a lot of problems with the misogyny and you know, like the women's rights and minority rights and stuff like that. Is that something that you know, like he would have?
He has he has problems with orthodoxy. And when orthodoxies are established, he could smell them like a mile away and he would resist. And he would resist in the form of humor, he would resist in the form of intelligence. He didn't like pieties as such. And the left, as everywhere, was full of these kind of slightly dogmatic positions that he would recoil from. And I really liked all that. I thought that's what good writers should do. They should provoke you to rethink your positions, and you should not go to bed feeling comfortable. I mean, the sadness with him is that he was treated very shabbily here.
Yeah,
you know, I remember when that event with Girish Karnad or whatever occurred. It was 50 years of Area of Darkness. Every Indian intellectual could acknowledge that it had created an entirely new moment in the history, in the literary history of this country. Everyone, whether they hated him or reviled, acknowledged Naipauls' presence. And suddenly it's like 50 years of Area of Darkness. Every book that has had an anniversary has been celebrated. And not only is there no celebration, but he arrives in India to just a week of vilification. I mean, everyone just came out.
Very severe at that, you know. It was quite, he was very roundly criticized all over, you know, like it was pretty. And how did he take that? What was your, like...
I think he sensed the tragedy of it. I remember him saying with, you know, even in relation to Africa, he said, you know, he said, I had to write about Africa. I didn't want to write about Africa. I had to write about Africa because I grew up among Africans. And he said, and now I have these books. The Africans don't want to read them. And the white people don't want to curl up with a book about Africa at night. And so, you know, I think he sensed the tragedy of his position, that it would take a different kind of person. Perhaps it almost depends on places like India and Africa reaching a kind of intellectual maturity for him to live again, because he doesn't interest the West. You know, I was at the funeral, and I was really shocked at the fact that he'd lived in England all his life. And we drove in through this kind of graveyard, and I remember the taxi driver saying, oh, this graveyard is popular among the Caribbean community. And I said, oh, that's funny, because I'm going for the funeral of a Caribbean writer. And he said, oh, would I know him? And I said, V.S. Naipaul. And he's like, V.S. And then I was like, oh, well, you know, he won a Nobel Prize. And he's like, that's quite the accolade. And you could just tell that you know, and it's a bit like, it's such a strange thing to have. I think it would not have happened in America. Had he been in America all his life and then won the Nobel Prize, the Americans would have really made a fuss over him. Yeah. But in England, they didn't have any idea what to do. He was politically unfashionable. He was completely the wrong kind of person for them.
Yeah. Before we sort of have a couple of questions, one question, there's this interview where he says, and I think that states his position in a way that a lot of other writings don't. My most difficult thing to overcome was being born in Trinidad, that crazy resort place. How on earth can you have serious writing from a crazy resort place? You know, was that something that kept
It's a Napoleon joke. I mean, it's just, that's what it is. It's half serious, it's half. I remember I quoted this in my piece, that I met him soon after my father had been killed in Pakistan, and I kept saying, you know, the press kept saying, they said, oh, do you think your father died for Pakistan? And so I asked Savidya, I said, do you think my father died for Pakistan? Better to say he died in Pakistan. So it's a joke, I think, and it's meant to like push you back a little. But yeah, I think we have a very short time for like a few questions.
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
All right, we'll have a few questions.
Hi, Aatish. I'm a big fan of your writing. So I would even say that you are doing a spectacular job of carrying on Mr. Naipaul's legacy, because we see glimpses of, you know, provocation of thought and devastating truth in some of your writing. So you were 18 when he discouraged you from, you know, going abroad and studying. What would you tell him now? I mean, would you have rather stepped boldly into the world?
Well, I don't think it was right, because at 18 I wouldn't have known what to do, but it stayed with me. That's what the Naipaul Critique is meant to do. It stays with you. And so when I encountered Babble in the West, I knew what I was looking at. When it came time to come back, I had a very different trajectory. I was able to get to things here that I perhaps would not have, because even in the way that, for instance, and I can say it now because he's not with us, that there's a moment in the Temple Goers where he shows me the Chola bronzes, and his way of making things that we don't normally know how to approach in India, he was able to make, and it was through very little things. He would admire the confidence. He would he would tell you something simple, like he would say, these are not merely objects of beauty, but they're the expression of a philosophical idea. And he would tell you what to look for. And all that stayed, and it was then possible to build on that. And I don't think my background would have led me in those directions otherwise.
Hi.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Excellent talk, Mr. Aatish.
Thank
But obviously you know him very well. I've had the fortune of meeting him a few times, and I never found him petty or never found him rude.
Yeah.
He was very, very much in control of himself,
Yeah.
very concerned, very soft.
Yeah.
The opposite of what people say about him.
Yeah.
But I've read that a lot of people say that, in one-on-one conversations, he's not been rude.
No, he could be both.
Yeah.
He could
Okay.
be, yeah.
And then the area of darkness, a much misunderstood book.
I mean, all of these things are existing side by side. And
And if you notice, he always said, or people said he was a Trinidadian writer. Towards the end, he said Trinidad born of Indian descent. She was getting more and more Indian, or more and more connected to India in some sense.
yeah. Should we have?
Hi. Hello. Sorry. Excuse me. Can I have this? Okay.
Oh.
Sorry.
Hi.
I have two quick questions.
Sure.
The first of which was again from an interview that Naipaul gave, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, when he said 4 or 5 lines into a book, he could tell if
I
it
know where
was
you're
written
going
by a
with this,
male
yeah.
or a female. I don't know if what angle he was coming from. Do you think he was right in thinking that, or do you think where was he coming from?
No, I think it was a bad remark. I mean, I think that what happened in the end was that especially among the English, he was kind of like trotted out and sometimes made to say things that in his writing he would never. He would have looked at it with much more depth. But this was something, and it was. It's a catastrophic career move because you lose half your readership.
And there was a
But
mock quiz on The Guardian. Can you guess if it's by a female writer based on what Naipaul said?
It's not. It's just. It wasn't. I don't think it was true. But it tells you something. His perspective certainly was very, very male. And the other day I was with a feminist writer in New York, and she said, like, I don't exist in his work, and as far as I'm concerned, he doesn't exist for me because I have no. And so all of that is I think that those things for me that was a more unfortunate moment actually.
And a quick follow-up to what you said earlier when he said you should not go to the West and study at the age of 18 because it'll fill you with babble. As somebody who did that, do you find yourself checking when you put down a line on paper and think, should I worry about whether babble is affecting what I've written, or should I reconsider what I've written based on what Naipauls?
I think once you're inoculated early, I don't think that I was. I think that he was suspicious of systems of thought, and because of the nature of my education, it was so brief, and because I'd been kind of. I don't think that I'd really been brought in that way. I hadn't really been indoctrinated, but I'd been kind of warned off from being indoctrinated, and so one never knows how free one's thoughts ever are, but I don't feel that I became necessarily a product in the way that he was worried about. I think that he wanted me to not lose a kind of originality, Actually, to answer your question, the real fear for me was his influence, because he was such a powerful physical, as a personality, but also that I'd already read all his work, and so I'm not. I think that every writer will have this moment. Coetzee had fully absorbed Beckett before he was able to move past Beckett, and you'll find many. Naipaul himself, which he denied later, was full of evil and war, and then was able to shrug him off. And so this is part of what influence does. But I was much more worried about the pressure of his personality.
Yeah, thank you, Aatish, for this wonderful discussion. I have a question on the India trilogy, which Naipaul has written, and we see towards the end, towards the third book, India, A Million Mutinies now, we see there is a very pronounced change in the way he approaches India. So my question is, one, how would you rate the three books in the trilogy in terms of how it describes India or the history of India? And the second is, what could be, other than circumstantial reasons, what could be a reason that Naipaul did not write about India after 1989, which is the third book?
So just to quickly answer your last question first, I think it was circumstantial. I think that he would give it a certain amount of period, and by the time he came around, he was doing other things. But for me, weirdly, the book that I love most is Wounded Civilization, because it has less of the anxiety of Area of Darkness. It has all of the thought even further developed. And what you don't, for me, Wounded Civilization is an incredibly beautifully written book. It's a very long book. It's too long, I would say. I think that Okay.
Hi. I'm reading Naipaul's letters that he exchanged with his father, the young Naipauls, and one of the things that comes out of his letters was that he's very selfish about writing. Selfish means he sees writing as a way to earn money, at least when he was 18.
Yeah.
In fact, he even jokes that how one of the girls in his classes thinks that writing is about pouring your heart out, which is nothing. I mean, so was he like that even in the later part of his life?
He was very unsentimental about it, and he would often say, writing is not merely an emanation of the spirit. It needs a certain infrastructure that supports writing, but also that his own discipline and his approach to books was he had to get rid of any illusions if he was to survive. And so he was not ever prepared to encourage writing for romantic purposes. People who want to publish their journals and who like to write poetry, and that kind of writing for him was very, very remote, very far away. For him, it was something with many clear guidelines that he followed almost like a religion, exactly like a religion, in fact.
I think we'll take one more question,
Okay.
and
The lady
since
over there
this is
has been asked,
marginalized by Naipaul, I think we should let a woman ask a
Exactly.
question.
So, I'm Dr. Lavanya, and thanks for that wonderful talk that you've been giving. You happened to indicate during your talk that Naipaul was against anything that might have been or sounded dogmatic, such as the women's liberation. Now, the question I'd like is, how is the women's liberation in any sense dogmatic?
So it wouldn't be the actual liberation that bothers him, but out of every movement come dogmas. They come ways of speaking, ways of, and he would push back against those. So we're in such a moment right now, and it's a moment where certain kind of speech can be proscribed when it comes to, a nice case where a friend of Naipauls, Ian Baruma, publishes this essay and finds himself, sacked, removed from the New York Review of Books. So he was able to identify how in moments, of course, there's never, whether it's the Indian freedom movement or whether it's the women's liberation movement or whether it's racial movements, he was not blind to the circumstances that were driving it, but once some of its aims had been achieved, it was possible for, as it often is for those movements, to form orthodoxies, and that was what he would resist.